This passage is about coral reefs in an Hawaiian island and how seaweed is destroying them and efforts that are being made to protect the coral reefs from seaweeds. Over the last 70 years, invasive seaweeds have inundated the northeast coast of the Hawaiian island of Oahu, spreading hundreds of feet and more per year and smothering the coral reefs in the Kaneohe Bay. The island's largest embayment, Kaneo Bay, has been called the Coral Kingdom, and researchers travel from far and wide just to see it. Today, though, many of its majestic reefs are engulfed by seaweed. So, it's talking about that there have been invasive seaweeds which have invaded the bay of one of Hawaii's islands, and this island is called Coral Kingdom because a lot of coral reefs are there which people come to see. But this seaweed is these coral reefs are being engulfed, totally surrounded by seaweed. At least one of these interloping species hitched a ride to the bay in the 1950s via the hull of a barge as it made its way from Guam. But much of this seaweed, broadly called macroalgae, was intentionally introduced in the 1970s by the researchers from the University of Hawaii who were experimenting with commercial cultivation of marine vegetation. These same species still litter the reefs, forming mats that block the sun, absorb oxygen and other nutrients, and crowd the reefs and inflict damage. How did the seaweed come in this island? One is that this seaweed might have just been carried in the hull of a barge, a big ship, as it came to Hawaii from Guam. But most part of the seaweed was introduced intentionally by the University of Hawaii researchers when they tried to see if marine vegetation can be commercially cultivated. So that is how human activity intentionally introduced seaweed without realizing the harm that they would do. Little bit came via the barge or the huge ship. Okay, that's what he says in the second paragraph. To rescue the corals and multitudes of marine life they harbor, the State of Hawaii Division of Aquatic Resources, the DAR, and the Nature Conservancy began deploying super sucker barges to vacuum up the seaweed. So, to get rid of the seaweed, the Division of Aquatic Resources or the DAR, one department in Hawaii, and natural conservative organizations sent a huge ship, a super sucker barge, many super sucker barges, which would suck up the seaweed, vacuum up the seaweed. Divers would pluck the seaweed from the leaves and siphon it through a hose back to the barge, where it could be sorted and later distributed to local farmers for fertilizer. So you had divers who'd go to the seaweed, take it, send it up through hoses, and they would later be got to land and given to the farmers to be used as fertilizer. However, divers found it impossible to pull in every microscopic fragment, and the seaweed would often return in a matter of months. They did this, but every time the seaweed would return in a matter of months because they could not remove it totally. Some parts would be left and that would grow. The DAR realized it needed reinforcements. Hundreds and thousands of hungry collector urchins, a species of sea urchins, that could consume the tiny seaweed fragments and access the remote crevices sheltering the root like structures that anchor the seaweed to the reef. After several years, the DAR retired its super sucker barges and began to rely solely on collector urchins to remove the remainder of the seaweed. So they came up with an idea. We need reinforcement. We need to remove the seaweed. So they used collector urchins. These are sea urchins, tiny sea organisms which eat up the seaweed, and they can access places which divers and barges cannot. So they were so successful that the DAR retired these super sucker barges, and now they rely entirely on these collector urchins to get rid of the seaweed. Collector urchins get their name because they have a propensity for amassing coral rubble, rocks, and algae for camouflage. Why are they collector? They collect all this for camouflage. Okay, often no larger than a baseball, these dark rodent critters means creatures, are endowed with sharp spines and tiny tube feet. feet. They're ideal for reef cleanup because they are ravenous for many types of algae, seagrasses, and unlike fish, do not migrate far after they've settled. They're ideal for removing seaweed because they're always hungry. So they eat up any amount of algae. And the other advantage is they don't migrate far from where they are. They don't migrate far from where they have settled. Although some scientific reports suggest that collector urchins were once the most abundant urchin in Caneo Bay, the natural population is relatively sparse today. At one point in the past, they were very abundant. They were abundant in this area, but now they are sparse. Now the population is smaller, much smaller. In fact, it's being called sparse. Sparse means very small. In 2010, the DAR began gathering these spiky critters from the ocean and bringing them back in the state-run hatchery to spawn. So to increase their numbers, they spawn them in the state-run hatchery. The number of fertile urchins it gathers at any time depends on the weather and wave surges, but the hatchery technicians are often able to raise enough juvenile urchins, baby urchins, to release batches of 4,000 to 7,000 back into the bay a few months at a time. So they collect these urchins so that they can breed them in the straight hatcheries. The number of fertile urchins they gather at any given time depends on the weather and wave surges, but the hatchery technicians are able to raise at least 4,000 to 7,000 juvenile, tiny, small, immature urchins into the bay, not full grown, a few months at a time. There, the urchins spend their time slowly migrating across the reef, grazing as they go. By November, the DAR would have released nearly 1 million urchins, but more are still needed. Why? Because there's so much seaweed. To augment the urchin population and to simultaneously curb the invasive seaweed, local researchers are investigating ways to complement the DAR's efforts. In July, scientists at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology became the first to cryptopreserve collector urchin embryos and rear them to competency. This is the culmination of a multi-layer project spearheaded by the University of Hawaii graduate Charlie Westbrook. He divided a method to store the embryos for extended periods of time by cooling them to allow temperatures to ultra low temperatures below 300 degrees Fahrenheit and slowly thawing them so that they can develop into full grown urchins. So they're devising new ways to grow, to create, to breed more urchins. And the last paragraph tells us what are the methods. All of the following arguments have been made in the passage except which one? So, which argument is not found in the passage? This should be easier. Seaweed inflict a lot of damage on coral reefs has been given in the passage. We want an argument that has not been given. An artificial way of rearing collector urchins has been found. Yes. Researchers who introduced seaweed in the 1970s did it with the intention of creating commercial marine vegetation. Yes. At some point in the future, all the seaweed will be destroyed by the sea urchins. The author has not said this. Author has not said all will go. He's saying we still require more. We still require more. These urchins are not enough. So more and more have been released. So therefore, he has not said that at one point, sometime, we will probably reach a point where there will be no seaweed. No. So the correct answer is D. We cannot infer D.